Uh, my grandfather was living in the village, and he was the person who handled grains. In other words, he had the grains in the warehouse, which was in his house. He was a grain merchant, and he had some land too, but he dealt with grain and gave the farmers flour and gave the farmers food. And then the Nazis came along, and he lost everything. He lost his house. He came to the United States, and this is interesting. Through Germany, he came, and his business was taken over by a Christian family who permitted him to live in the house, in the bedroom and all that. And they were responsible in seeing that he gets out of Germany. And they were responsible for him to get on the Orient Express Railroad through China and come to the United States on the West Coast. But he had lost everything, except he had family. That's the only thing. But otherwise, he lost everything. They were alone in Germany, by the way, during the Hitler times, at a certain time. But they were respected. And on the other hand, the Nazis wanted to get rid of them. And what did they do? They put them in camps. Luckily, they made it out in time to go to Shanghai. But it's beyond understanding. My grandmother was really from Holland, from Dutch family, and settled in Germany. But some of her family members couldn't find a husband because they didn't have the money or the support they needed of a family. One person once asked me when I went to the theater and all that. I said, you know, as a kid, I remember going to the opera, but later on, I wasn't allowed to go to movie houses. I wasn't allowed to go to restaurants. I wasn't allowed to go to fairs. I wasn't allowed to go to the city park. They had some benches that they put aside, but everything else was off limits. And I remember my father, he helped somebody during the war. He was in the German army, and my father helped him to walk again. He was wounded and all that. And he said to my father, my parents and I have a restaurant, and your family will always be invited to our restaurant, and will provide food for you and your kids and all that. My father took me, and after a while the man came over and said, I can't have you here anymore, you're Jewish. And this is, my father helped this man to survive during the during the First World War. And then this happened. You know, it's beyond understanding. I tell you that right now. Because, you know, some of the things I went through as a child. I remember walking in the park and the kids came running after me and screaming and yelling. And I remember even the words they used. You'd have the Teufel had, which means Jew, Jew, hate, hate, hate. Only if the devil gets you. I mean, why would anybody shout something like this? And this came back from the Middle Ages, I mean, from ancient times, and they used these words in German. And it's beyond me. Why would they say this? Is my brother got into trouble in schools. A few things. He had a Hitler Youth escort him from school and to school. Would you believe that? To school and from school. The kid was in uniform, and my brother paid him off, not with money, but with magazines. He had books, he had magazines, he gave it to him. and his kid walked him each day from school. And one day, I remember my brother went on a hike with the school, and he came to a little town, and there was a big sign that Jews were not permitted in the town. So all the kids in his class said, "Hey, Manfred," his name was Fred, but it was Manfred, "you can't come with us in town because you're not permitted." And the teacher didn't know what to do because it was his class and he just couldn't let my brother just stand there. So he actually hit some of the kids and said he's going through the town. But the thing is this, I went through this also because a lot of the teachers enjoyed sending me to other teachers with notes. And when I went into the classroom, I had to give the Hitler salute. And the kids would laugh, they realized I was Jewish, give a Hitler salute. I mean, the whole thing was ridiculous. Everything about school was ridiculous. Because we had rallies, and I one time met the principal of the school on the street with my parents, and I took my hat off because, in Germany, a schoolmaster or a principal is a pretty high individual, and I greeted him. He called me to his office, and he said, "As long as you're attending this school, you have to greet me with a German salute, Heil Hitler." So I said, "All right, if you want me to, I'll do it." And I walked out, and he yelled at me. I remember him yelling at me, come back. You have to do the salute now." He had to give the Hitler salute. Can you imagine this? I mean, some of this stuff is so stupid. It's beyond me, but I went through it. But the moment that happened, all Germany broke out, and all the synagogues, and all the Jewish institutions, and all the Jewish stores, and anything to do with Jews were demolished by the Nazis. And the men were put in camps, in prison. Not camps, I shouldn't say. My father was selected for the camp, but they were put in prison. And it was a terrible scene. I mean, I could tell you the stories because my father would tell me stories that happened. And when my father was selected to go to Dachau with a few others, there was a Jewish man who said, "Let's say a prayer for them because they're going to a major camp, a prison camp." I mean, Dachau was known for cruelty. Some of the things the Germans did was ridiculous. Anyway, he said, "Let's say a prayer for our brethren who are being taken into this concentration camp." But they didn't know what to say. What were they going to say? So one man said, "Let's say the Kaddish." Now the Kaddish is a Jewish prayer that is said when somebody dies. It doesn't mean that you talk about his death, but it's a prayer that's all-encompassing. And this man said, "Well, let's say the Kaddish." And the Jewish men who were in prison with him said, "Okay, let's all say it." And then the Nazis took the man who came up with the prayer and said, "You're going with him." And he was put in a concentration camp too. So my father was in a bus, and the bus was called Kraft durch Freude, which means joy, power through joy. It was something that the Nazis had where they took people for outings. And they took that bus and they transported him to Dachau. But the moment he arrived in Dachau, When he got off the bus, all the men were more or less thrown off the bus, and some were beaten. And they were in a concentration camp. My father was in the concentration camp for 1 month. Now, the first postcards I have, they're in there in the book. Some are dictated. In other words, he didn't write them. They were dictated by the Nazis. And later on, he started dictating them. But the Nazis said all the requirements. You cannot send a postcard out unless you receive a postcard. In other words, my father had to get a postcard in order to send a postcard. I mean, the stories are very peculiar and strange. But to me, it was learning what evil can do. My mother, when my father was put in a concentration camp, she grabbed me and she went to the German the Gestapo, and she said to the officer, "How dare you put my husband in a concentration camp?" Now, my father was selected because the Jews were lined up and they counted them off and said, every second man step forward, you're going to the concentration camp. And my father was one of them. Anyway, so the Jews in Germany had to pay a tax to flee Germany. It didn't say flee Germany, they called it Reichsfluchtsteuer, meaning you're leaving. But my father couldn't get out, but he had to pay a tax. So you were reduced to losing all your belongings. Not only belongings, because you had to turn in all your gold and silver. Now, my father had rings from his parents, wedding bands from his mother, wedding band from his father. He had gold rings, he had candelabra and all that. And when the Nazis said it had to be turned in, my father said, "I'm going to bury it. I'm going to bury it in the back garden." And I remember my mother pleading with my father. She was crying to him. And I remember her being on the floor with my father, begging him. And my father turned it in. And the Germans took the stuff. And of course, it was all melted down, the gold and silver and all that. And he didn't get compensated for it until the end of the war. The German government gave some money. I forgot how much. It wasn't very much, a few $100 for all the things that he turned in. But you see the list of all his belongings that he turned in because he made a copy of it. It's in this book. The Germans would take this gold and silver, and the only wedding bands he was allowed to keep was this wedding band of his wife, my mother, and his wedding band. But the wedding bands of his parents and the rings from his relatives and the silver and the gold all had to be turned down. And what the Germans did, they didn't put it in the museum. They melted it down. So they had gold bars and silver bars. Did you know that? Or you never knew that? Crazy. Can you imagine? I mean, some of these things are ancient things. You don't melt them down because it's gold that the Germans did. So, the story of leaving Germany, I remember that I was in the train, I had to get off. The German inspectors came, and I remember my mother looking at a poster, and the poster was from Augsburg. And she said to my father, "I'm homesick." I thought it was very unusual for my mother to say. She's leaving Germany, and she looks at a picture of the town she lived in, and she says, "I'm homesick." So we got on the train, and we went to England. Now, in England, we really couldn't find lodging But what happened is, when England went to war, a lot of the well-to-do people in London, some of them, they gave up their homes to people who would be willing to pay to stay there. So we stayed in an apartment, not alone, but with some other people in the same apartment. We shared it together. And we built an air raid shelter. And I went to the air raid shelter. And later on, when I was on the ship coming to the United States, I found out that a bomb went into my bedroom and blew it up. The German bomb, during the Blitz. So, my adventures are crazy. I had a gas mask in London. Can you imagine having a gas mask? I did get a gas mask in Germany, by the way, too. But the ones for Jews were low quality. They gave the rejects and permitted the Jews to have these gas masks. But in London, I did have a regular gas mask. But they didn't drop any gas, really, in London. But I remember walking with my parents in Germany, in London, and my father spoke German because he didn't speak English. His English was very poor. I learned English in school from a private teacher, and my mother picked up English. So we all spoke English on the street, except my father. And he was accosted by some people who said, "You can't talk German on the streets of London." Can you imagine that somebody telling him, "You can't talk German on the streets of London"? Crazy period. So we went from, when we finally got permission to come to the United States, we had to go to the American consulate, and my father couldn't pass the test, physical test. Why? Because in the First World War, in the trenches where he was 4 years, he contracted rheumatic fever. And that rheumatic fever deformed his heart. He had heart failure, a Herzklappenfehler, a leaky valve. A leaky valve? Herzklappenfehler. So when we were in London, getting ready to come to the United States, and I had to have a physical exam, my mother had one, my father had one, and he failed it. And I remember my mother saying to me and my brother, "I'm going to stay with your father in London because he can't go to the United States. And you boys, you go to the United States and meet the family," which left my father's brother, who was in New York City, living in Washington Heights, where the refugees lived in Washington Heights. So my mother was very upset. And then all of a sudden, the doctor comes in and looks at my father and says, "I give you permission to go to the United States." We went. I was on the ship for 17 days. I had to carry a life preserver around all the time. And then after a while, I said, "The hell with it." And then I put it in the cabin. So one day I'm on the boat, and all of a sudden, all the lights went out, and I couldn't find a life preserver. I didn't have a life preserver, and I said, "Well, that's it." And then after a while, the lights came on again. I said, "I'll never do that again. I'll walk around with a life preserver." But we went to Washington Heights, where a lot of the German Jewish refugees live. It's for Margaret and Trudy. "Their holy dust awaits me. Hands cannot hold or form it into that soft frame, the laughter of these girls whose lives were doomed from the outset, beaten by racial nonsense and hate. Lips that piously spelled French and Latin words and bent knees to friendly nuns. O stones, build me a hill in their name. Form a grove of cedars, a path to walk on, sea on one side, mountains on the other. I don't remember what their eyes were like, or how their hands composed the music of their being. Now their soft voices bend in the wind, reciting Heine. I thought it was a very touching poem, but there's a number of poems in there about my father in the concentration camp, things like that. But, I don't know. Well, I feel a lot of people don't realize what's happening, and I feel the younger children should be aware of what is happening in the world and what happens to society, that they shouldn't ignore it, that they should understand the relationship between human beings and mankind. I feel that I am shocked at some of the things that people say to me and all that, and I realize that they're not aware what the world is all about. Certainly, the story of my life and what I went through as a child of the Holocaust and my girl cousins and all of them being murdered. I mean, to me, is something that I cannot really express enough to the societies, that this is a world where we are all human beings and have to treat each other with respect and understanding, and not to be prejudiced and be bigoted and be nasty and be sort of an individual who doesn't really know what they're saying, what they're doing. It's to me, it's beyond me that I had to go through something like this, and my parents had to go through something like this, and my cousins had to go through this. I mean, it's just unbelievable.